While 2020 was a very difficult year, it was also a really interesting year for observing human behaviour globally and how brands engage with their audiences through their content. As the wider implications of COVID-19 look set to have a long-lasting impact on how we live and work as a global community for years to come, we thought it would be really worthwhile focusing on how COVID has changed consumer behaviour. So, Rob, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, Rach, I think it's really interesting because you're in the UK, I'm in Sydney, and there's been big differences between how Australia and the UK have reacted or acted. You know, it feels like Australia acted and the UK slowly reacted. I'm not there, but in our conversations, that's that kind of sense I get around it. Yeah. And right at the start, there was a lot of fear, no doubt about it. And for a few months, you know, there was a fear factor. There was the looking at our leaders to see how they coped. There was looking at our leaders that we work for and in businesses to see how they coped, and was looking at businesses to see how they coped. But one of the things we saw is after about 3 months, there was that nervousness still, but we started to see, you know, hope, and we also started to see trust starting to bubble through in our sentiment tracking in Australia. And from a marketing perspective, I guess one of the things that was really interesting is the fact that, you know, brands had to really show empathy and they needed to show understanding. But unfortunately, a lot of brands just did it the same way. So we had imagery of empty streets. We had a sentimental voiceover. You know, we had that piano music, you know, in the background. But the smart ones really involved and brought their customers and audiences together and celebrated the fact that we would get through this together. And I think there's still that nervousness, but there's a core emotional driving opportunity of the fact that here in Australia, communities do come together, where in the UK, you know, it's just about, my God, will we get through this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we look at the psychology of this, it's quite interesting to, you know, I've worked in marketing for 20 years now, and I look back and most marketing is still built on that Freudian model of human motivation, that humans have two innate needs and we tap into these in most of our marketing briefs, and they are either to increase pleasure or reduce pain. And I think what's kind of interesting with the pandemic is it shook us out of even a model that might work in. And I think you're right in that in Australia, there was far more probably frustration than fear. And in the UK, it is still very fear driven. So perhaps that Freudian model does work. But I think in COVID, the motivation, you know, factor has become far less attractive. And I think we need to look at the recent work of Nir Eyal, and he does a lot of work on human behaviour. And he works on the premise that humans are only motivated by one thing, and that's to relieve discomfort. And I think this really is something that's happening now globally, because the discomfort in Australia is frustration, and actually there is hope in that, but how we still need to, as brands, react to this need to reduce the frustration, and obviously very evident in the UK. And so when we look at this, we've kind of seen what's happened with the brands that have got it right, in that they've switched their marketing insights, if you like, to promoting products and services that avoid a feeling that's unpleasant to us. And they've used the community and that sense of love and belonging to kind of take those feelings away. And because, you know, 2020 was super uncomfortable, like everything about it was uncomfortable. And I guess this poses the question, is human behaviour from a marketing point of view primarily motivated to relieve discomfort moving forward for 2021 and beyond? And will we see more ads and more content and more campaigns that kind of focus on things like relieving hunger, relieving boredom, relieving cold, relieving heat, overheating, pain, social isolation, frustration, not feeling good enough? I mean, it's a question to ask, right?
Yeah, or is it also that piece that, now, like the brands that did well were the brands that obviously had a product offer that was relevant to help people get through it. But then there's that thing that we've talked about, is that home almost became part of the family again. So, and our good friends at Winning Appliances probably became even more relevant to tell a very relatable story. And from there, we also saw this growth of not only virtual events in the business world, but what I'd call pop-up social consumer events where like-minded people could come together and share stories and get through it in that sort of way. And from a content perspective, we saw what we're calling a multi-screen genre, which will live on, according to one of our directors, as a genre from the era. And while we're kind of getting tired of that on-screen time, there are opportunities for brands to plug into passion points and move into what we're calling the virtual space, where it's engagement with consumers both in social platforms, but also bringing it into real-world environments, and then getting us back to good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we're satisfying that safety element, but also celebrating and bringing in some belonging and putting some effort into that as a brand, where you're not just creating content or campaigns that talk about your products, but actually really celebrate like-mindedness with consumers, is actually a really good way to actually build that self-esteem with customers and the relevance the brand has through shared values.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up Maslow's hierarchy of needs there, because I think this time last year, in March, April, we were very much pushed down Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the entire focus was on safety, psychological safety, shelter, with the concept of cocooning, much more retreating into our houses globally, regardless of how strict the lockdown is. Home has become a real focus. But I think you're right around, we very quickly moved slightly up the hierarchy of needs to really focus on love and belonging. And I think that's been the really important thing for 2020, and will be continue to be for 2021 and 22, is that we're not looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs where marketers have typically focused, which is on the esteem level, the fourth level up, but actually one down to that love and belonging. And I think brands have got real opportunity there, because like what you talked about with the virtual events and the social virtual events, even in the home, brands they're not just on mobile now, they're on mobile consumed, where people are far more aware that they're in the home, and they're inviting the brand into the home to almost cocoon with them. And I think the brands that can really embrace that sense of love and belonging with the family in the home, in a cocooning environment, will be the ones that will rock it for the next year or two to come. And Winning are definitely a brand that have done that really well from my point of view.
Yeah, and we've also got fatigue. So here we go into lockdown, we come out of lockdown, we come together as a community. I guess what's interesting when you look at, say, the US, and particularly the US, where that community spirit just hasn't existed. Where something we've seen here is the fact that, we know we've got to get through it. And it's almost, the country that comes together through war. COVID was the enemy, and we came together, and there's some sentiment tracking which is showing community is up to 60, 80% in some of the states around Australia, compared to in the US where it's down at about 30%. And that's because you've got that political to and fro happening, and so many other things happening on the ground in the States, and also to a certain degree in the UK. So we're at a stage where, from a content perspective, we're almost celebrating the fact we fought through. And I've seen a couple of brands at the moment using the word joy, which is really interesting. I love the word. It's just such a powerful word. And it's a great way for a brand to go, you know what, hey, life's too short. Let's enjoy ourselves, right? And the fact we're still looking after each other. And the Lamb campaign for Australia Day was a great example of that, breaking down the walls and now coming back together. While in the UK and the US, it's a bit of a different story still.
Yeah, I think from a UK point of view, we'll see, I hope we'll see that word joy being used in the summer. The feeling of coming together is definitely happening with the vaccination programme, and there's a quiet optimism there, which is it's exciting, but it's also very nervously exciting. I think the journey is very different. In Australia, it's like you've avoided the massive issues. We're having to get the vaccine to get out of it. So it's a different journey, but I think some of the feelings and emotions are going to be the same. Just the amount of casualties are far more significant in the UK.
Yeah.
So I think brands are going to be way more careful about how much they use that word.
Yeah, fair point. But then, what are the three things to be thinking about in 2021, whether it's in Australia or the UK? So does it come back to really looking at your purpose and how you're living that purpose through your content, how you're involving the audience in your content and the conversation? So you're a brand that is understanding of the situation, whether it be here or the UK or the US. And then what's the action that you really want to create where you're adding value as a brand, not only to consumers' lives, but to, the wider community. And from there, this ever-changing world. Is that a fair summary of what we need to be thinking about? Or there's no magic bullet, right?
No, I think you absolutely nailed it around. I think it's going to become increasingly more difficult for brands to understand the environment in which their consumers operate in, because it's very different for every consumer. So I think there is going to have to be a lot more care taken with that and a lot more strategic work that goes into it. But I think once you give it that consideration, you're absolutely right. You have to also promote an action, because I don't think there's any room for brands that are just spectators of this. You have to be seen to be involved in it and allowing your audience to be involved in it, because whatever way this cocooning trend continues, I can't wait to get out of my house and do things, but home has become a more significant place, and it feels more vulnerable to allow brands into that space. So I think brands have to be really cognizant of that, and I'm really excited to see the ones that do it really well, involving the consumer with them to do that.
Well, thanks for the chat, Rach. As usual, some fantastic insights from you and lots of waffling from me. If you'd like to find out more, follow us on LinkedIn or pop in to 3rdspace.com in the UK or 3rdspace.com.au in Australia.